video here talking about unemployment in the labor force. This is Unit 2 for macroeconomics. So if you're still on Unit 1, you shouldn't be on this video. I'm going to start by sharing the screen because a lot of this stuff is just a verbal concept here. We're going to go to this slideshow here and talk a little bit about categories of unemployment. Now, I'm going to begin by talking about the fact that not all unemployment is the same. Here's some examples. We have a guy named Todd who clocked in drunk, mooned his boss, and was fired. We have a lady named Cecilia who is about to have a baby, and she's decided to not be in the labor force and not work for a while. And so she's turned in her notice as she gets ready to have her child. And this fellow Warren here has decided to focus on school and be a full-time student, so he's not going to be working at his job anymore. All three of these individuals represent the same category of unemployment. Notice what's going on here. Now we got three other people. This fellow Cesar was working in a factory. He lost his job because the factory closed. He's got skills as a factory assemblyman, but there's only job openings for IT people, engineers, and nurses, and he doesn't have skills to work in that job. This fellow Angelino was a master typesetter working in a print shop, but technology changed and his position became obsolete. He wants to work, but he doesn't have any types of skills that works for the current type of industry he wants to work on. Winnie here was working for a long time in information technology, but she was laid off about a year and a half ago. She applied and was interviewed for jobs, but didn't get any offers for about the first 6 months. But then after 6 months, the offers and not the offers, but the application approvals and the interviews just dropped off. In all three cases, we've got situations where there's a skills issue at work. These people represent the same kind of unemployment. Now, these last three here, Donald and Sophia, they were working in accounting and information tech, but the economy went into recession. Companies they worked for laid off 10% of their staff, and they were some of the unfortunate that got laid off. And Wayne over there on the right had a restaurant that was very popular, but when the economy went into recession, his restaurant went bankrupt, and he went from self-employed to self-unemployed. All three of these people represent the same kind of unemployment, and it's different from the other two slides. I want you to understand that not all unemployment is the same. Some is definitely worse than others. The causality makes a bit of a difference, and even within major causalities, there's some nuances and some subcategories to talk about. But to understand unemployment, we have to first understand what the labor force is. You take a look at everybody who has payroll taxes like Social Security or income tax showing up on their tax ID, that's their Social Security number or tax ID number. And it's either shown up over the last 4 weeks prior to the second Wednesday of the month, the official day of record for the labor force, or these people have been actively applying for jobs and interviewing. And again, they have to give a Social Security number or tax ID to apply for a job, and it has to be verified. And again, we count those people as well. This consists of people that are both employed and unemployed, those who are working and paying payroll taxes, those who are not working and applying for jobs actively. This is mostly American citizens and legal residents who are not institutionalized, meaning not in jail, not in a mental hospital. Between the ages of 16 and 68, there are some states where you have people under 16 working in some jobs legally, and 68 is not a hard ceiling. If somebody is 70 years old and still working part-time or full-time, they're in the labor force. And all you have to work to be counted is 20 paid hours over a 4-week period of time. That's 5 hours a week. They don't do fractional members of the labor force, folks. You're either in or you're out. Or they have been actively applying for jobs during the 4-week period before the second Wednesday of the month. This is how our Department of Labor and Department of Commerce will measure the labor force. Now, the labor force participation rate is not the same as the unemployment rate. Not everybody in the population is considered employment eligible due to age restrictions, disabilities, mental illness, incarceration, and legal status. The employment eligible are everybody who's in the general population that could apply for and take a job with no restrictions whatsoever. The participation rate, the labor force participation rate, is the percentage of the employment eligible that are actually in the labor force, either employed or unemployed and actively seeking paid work. A participation rate of 70% or more is considered healthy, while 65% or below is considered unhealthy, and we're right now around 61%, which is actually kind of low. This is actually better than it was a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, it was 59.5%, so we've improved a bit, but we're nowhere near a healthy participation level. So to use a Venn diagram for the visual learners, the general population, about 330 million Americans, about 180 million employment eligible, about 100 million in the labor force, and then a certain number of the labor force unemployed. Notice people that are in between the green and the blue are not counted as unemployed. These are discouraged non-workers, discouraged workers, or people who have chosen to leave the labor force temporarily. Now we've got two rates of unemployment. Lowercase u sub r is the annual rate of unemployment. It's the percentage of unemployed members of the labor force as of the second Wednesday of the month. It's based upon all categories, regardless of reason. If you are a member of the labor force who's currently unemployed, you're part of the unemployment rate. The natural rate of unemployment, U sub RN for short, is where you count only those workers who are unemployed, not because of recession in the business cycle, and divide that by the total in the labor force. So in other words, we're looking at what we call frictional and structural unemployment. You're like, huh? We'll define that in just a minute. The natural rate of unemployment is not a fixed measure. 95% confidence intervals between 4 and 8%. I've seen natural rates of unemployment in the 3% range before. I've seen them in the 9% range, depending upon surrounding circumstances. But the natural rate of unemployment is what our unemployment rate would be if we didn't have any so-called recessionary or cyclical unemployment. Now, the categories of unemployment. 3 major categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. 2 subcategories. Seasonal is part of frictional, and induced is part of structural. Frictional unemployment is voluntary unemployment, meaning people have chosen to leave their job to look for a new or better job, or they've done something stupid that's led to their being unemployed, or they're transitioning out of the labor force, like going back to school full-time or having a baby. It also includes people that are brand new entrants to the workforce. Somebody turns 16 and applies for his or her first job. That's a new entrant to the labor force, and until they're hired or drop out, they're frictionally unemployed. Or somebody who re-enters after an absence. I've known some cases of some women that had babies, left the workforce for a couple of years, and then re-entered a couple of years later. And so during their re-entry period prior to getting rehired, they are frictionally unemployed. Structural unemployment is not voluntary. It is the result of a difference between the skills that are possessed by the unemployed workers and the skills required to fill jobs. If you're an unemployed factory worker, and the only job openings are for nurses and IT professionals, you don't have the skills to fill the job. And so your skills don't match the available jobs, you are structurally unemployed. But this also includes long-term unemployed workers whose skills may be in demand, but because their skills are stale, they are not current or up to date, they're having a hard time getting rehired as a result of it. I want y'all to understand that frictional and structural unemployment aren't necessarily bad things. We always have people entering and exiting the labor force. People always do stupid things to get fired, for example. We have people whose skills become out of date as technology advances, which means it's time to acquire new skills or upgrade your skills or get them current. And so these two are basically normal parts of the ebb and flow of life. Cyclical unemployment is the one that we're worried about. It's the involuntary unemployment that's simply caused by recession in the business cycle. Now let's talk about the subcategories. Seasonal unemployment. There are certain jobs. Think about lifeguards. Think about some of the sales help that works in retail that primarily work a few months out of the year. Lifeguards mostly work from like May through September, and the retail sales help that you see at the mall and that you see in some stores is only working heavily between, say, November through January. And so people that work in these seasonal jobs are aware the jobs are seasonal. If they don't have a job during the off season, so to speak, they will be seasonally unemployed. A lot of people that work in the hospitality industry, like some resorts, for example, tend to be seasonal. Like Winter Park, Colorado is primarily a winter resort, whereas some of the beach resorts you might see in the Jersey Shore are primarily summer resorts. And so sometimes people go from one resort to another to keep employed all year round. But there's some people that want to stay in one locality and they work during the heavy season and they save money to cover the off season. Construction can be that way as well. Seasonal is part of frictional because workers are choosing jobs they know are seasonal. Induced unemployment kicks back to price floor. If the minimum wage rate, whether it's by contract with the labor union or by law, statute law, is set above market equilibrium, more people look for a job and fewer people are hired. We end up having induced unemployment. The thing about union contract wages, they apply to people with certain types of specialized skills, and the minimum wage rate applies to people that has low-level general skills. Since induced unemployment is tied to the skills of the workers, it is part of structural. All right, so we're going to go back to those people over here. Let's take a look at Todd, Cecilia, and Warren. All 3 of them made choices. 2 of them made a good choice, 1 of them made a stupid choice, but they're all becoming unemployed because they chose to do so. Which category is this? If you said frictional, you're correct. Warren, Donald, and Sophia. The economy went into recession. They lost their jobs. Which category do they represent? We're talking major categories. That's correct. Cyclical. These three folks, Cesar, Angelino, and Winnie, they have skills issues. Either the skills are no longer in demand, in the case of Cesar and Angelino, or the skills are stale, in the case of Winnie. They represent structural unemployment. All righty. So it's not hard to understand these things once you get there. Now, here's a nice little Venn diagram for the visual folks. All the unemployed workers are in one set. Frictional is one group, structural is another group, and cyclical is the third group. Seasonal is part of frictional, and structural includes the induced inside of it, and there's no overlap. This is not proportional, by the way. I was just dividing it into three parts and doing this on the fly. Now, we've talked about the unemployment rate. Just a reminder, the overall unemployment rate is composed of everything, frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment, while the natural rate of unemployment is only made of frictional and structural. It does not include cyclical. Please note, because seasonal is part of frictional and induced is part of structural, they are included in both unemployment rates. Now, this is an important piece you need to remember for later. The level of GDP associated with the natural rate of unemployment is called potential GDP. Think of it as a maximum potential level of gross domestic product under current circumstances, available technology, labor skills, etc. Some textbooks call it Y sub P. Some say GDP sub P. Some say GDP sub F. Some say RNO sub F. Some say real GDP sub F. I like to call it real GDP sub F, the potential GDP. Now, I want to emphasize it's the level of GDP the economy could achieve if there were no cyclical, aka recessionary unemployment. Potential GDP is associated with the peak of a business cycle, and it is often referred to as full employment, full production level of GDP. Potential GDP is associated with the natural rate of unemployment. Be mindful of all of these things here. Now, some textbooks call this ECON's law. Some call it ECON's rule of thumb. It's really a rule of thumb because it ain't that accurate, y'all. Actual GDP is below potential GDP by 2 to 2.5% for every 1% in the unemployment rate that's attributed to recession of the business cycle. So in other words, if our actual rate of unemployment were, say, 7%, and our natural rate of unemployment were 4%, that means 3% of the labor force, 7 minus 4, is unemployed due to recession. And so we take 3 and multiply by 2. That tells us our actual GDP is at least 6% below potential. Or we multiply it by 2.5, or it could be up to 7.5% below potential. What that translates to, based on the U.S. economy, is every 1% of the labor force unemployed due to recession causes a loss of just under $400 billion in GDP. And that is a non-recoverable loss. So, in conclusion, okay, stop the screen share before everybody gets dizzy. Okay, what I want y'all to understand here is that there's all kinds of reasons behind unemployment, but I want to emphasize that you could have a low rate of unemployment, but if the labor force participation rate is also low, that's not a good thing. You could have a high rate of unemployment, but if it's coupled with a high labor force participation rate, that might not be a bad thing. You have to look at both of them together, because sometimes somebody who has a political bent will harp on one and ignore the other. And you can't ignore facts or data. You have to take them together and use what we know about them to understand what it fully means, what the full impact is to the economy. So hopefully this clears up some of your understanding about the labor force and unemployment. Have a good one, y'all, and I'll see you soon.